Okay, we're here for a special edition of the program called What's Going On, and we're here at the studio on a regular day. We're going to be doing some taping prior to my leaving the country. I'll be out of the country for 5 weeks, and we're going to be doing some programs in addition to what we would normally do. And we're taping today on, this is really on Saturday. We'll be airing on the regular time period of the program. As you know, our program comes on Mondays at 2 o'clock, and we are here for the next hour. Hope you stay tuned. We're going to be talking about a few things that have to do with some of the pressing issues that are up and running, and people are talking about it. And we want to add our little 2 cents in on it and make sure that our, vo- our little voice out here in one of the small studios that's out here. We have a small studio. We have a big voice, and hopefully one day we have a big platform. I admire those that have a larger platform and making some use of it. And some names that come to mind are people. I think Candace Owens does a good job, and I really like Megan Kelly. I think Megan Kelly has made a 180-degree turn. She's a major voice out there right now. Has a very big megaphone, and I like it when they use it responsibly, which means that they are doing some research and not just getting up there and moding on the air and making all kinds of wild claims. And there are some out there doing that now. But Megan Kelly's not one of them, and Candace Owens is not one of them. I
Do
would
you, s-
say,
do you see where the Daily Wire is actually in financial straits? The company she was with when she was with Shapiro,
yeah, they kicked her out of there
they kicked her
because
out of there because she's. Well, I mean, there actually is a guy who's connected. I can't remember the guy's name. He actually advocates if anybody criticizes anything that Israel does, United States citizen, they should be in prison for it.
have they heard
I mean,
about we have a
no, they're okay with that when it's on them. Back in the
yeah
'60s, they
yeah
loved using it.
yeah
Yeah,
they don't realize that we take the First Amendment in this country seriously. At least half of the country does, and if without that, you might as well go over there and live in China. And that's what we if we don't get off this road to China, we on the road to Beijing right now. If we don't get off this road, we'll be in China. China will be we'll be living in China, United States.
yeah, they'll be over here because let's face it, well, like what Whitmer she wanted to do, she wanted the battery company, it was to be set up in Michigan. It
Yeah,
wasn't going to employ local people. It was going to bring in Chinese nationals.
yeah.
Yeah,
Well, John, it's going to be we have a lot of work to do, and we're going to be a part of that work. We got to do our part, and we're going to stay around and do what we can to slow this engine down. Hopefully, we can stop it at some point. We got to first of all slow it down because we got a runaway train right now, and we got to slow it down and then halt it so that what is getting ready to, if we don't do that, this is not going to end well because we've seen what autocracies have done in the past, and when they get on that course, the momentum becomes something that it takes over the reins, and before you know it, you're living in tyranny. And somebody should go and read these books that deal with that. How people how countries have gotten on that road and found out when it's too late they couldn't get off that road. It develops a momentum of its own, and before you know it, it's taking over the reins, and you can't you just it's so the momentum is so powerful. You can't at some point you can't stop it. And I look at all these these totalitarian governments in the past. You can concentrate on the Nazi regime from 32, really from 33 until 1945 in Germany, and they didn't intend that. But after some of the events that began to happen and a tumbling of those events, that momentum could not be stopped, was not stopped. It took a world war, 6 to 8 million people perished in that war. And if that had been headed off when you had Chamberlain talking about his peace in our times, and his idea was that he had actually signed a pact in Munich, and that was going to end. We're now going to become cut buddies. And I guess he'd been reading those stories about that, and they lived happily ever after, and went back to London. And pulled out the paper and didn't realize that agreement wasn't as good as the paper was written on. It's a waste of paper. But sometimes if you don't nip this in the bud and clip its wings before it gets soaring above the political landscape, and you don't stop it, then at some point the inevitable conclusion is that it's going to get out of control, and you're going to have the end results you've had in the past. And people need to read these books so that you won't be repeating these mistakes over and over again. And it really is true that those that don't know history are doomed to repeat its mistakes, because if you don't know where the quagmire, the bugaboo is located in these ditches that are waiting for you to fall into. If you don't know where they are based upon some studied history of the past, and you don't recognize the signs, then you can get on that train very fast and be going down that track, seemingly not to the end in which it's going, but after it takes life of its own, you will eventually get there. And that's what is happening when you read history. You see the totalitarian instinct. In our country, one of the things we have to appreciate a lot more of, and we don't appreciate it enough, and that is the great framers of this country. These were not lightweights. These were persons that had done a tremendous amount of study. I don't know, as I look at the 55 persons that eventually showed up in Philadelphia in 1787, and you kind of pick out a name, you go and research that name, and everybody knows the major ones that were there through the writing of the Federalist Papers. You know about John Jay, the lesser of the three, and then Alexander Hamilton, probably the greatest of the three minds that were doing the Federalist Papers, and then James Madison, of course, the father of the Constitution. But there were some others that are not well known. When you go and read their biographies, you can see these people were not there just filling up a seat. These were some learned persons with that at the convention, and that's why they were able to come up with what they came up with, something that hasn't been come up with by any other nation anywhere in the world. And we couldn't do that again with any of the scholars we have now in this country. At all these major universities that you have right now, uh, you can name the universities, Ivy League schools, and all of the rest of them, and you won't find the kind of academic acumen that you had there in Philadelphia in that room. I don't know of anyone who would match up with Alexander Hamilton. I don't agree with Hamilton and a lot of his Federalist ideas, but I have to admire intellect when I see it. And he was definitely an intellectual. I think he's one of the one. I think that's why Ayn Rand wrote when she said that the founders were the first intellectuals and so far the last. I think she was mostly talking about. She didn't mention this, but I can deduce by what I know about the founders, and then reading her comment about they're the first intellectuals this country has produced, and so far the last. I think that she's concentrating more on Hamilton than she is others, because although James Madison is the father of the Constitution, the person that's head and shoulders above Madison as far as the intellect, and I'm saying here about Madison, he is the lawgiver, but above the intellect of James Madison, as great as he was, Alexander Hamilton soared above Madison. There's no there's no doubt about that. And sometimes what I notice is that some of the scholars can't deduce some of the Federalist Papers that were written either by Hamilton or written by James Madison. They have a hard time discerning what writer, because they were all on kind of up there in soaring in the clouds now. I mean, soaring with the eagles. But I think you can distinguish the writings when you. I mean, some are saying that 51, for example. There's a lot of claims over that one. A lot of persons saying that 51. They can't discern, was that Hamilton or was that Madison? Well, if you're not having any problem discerning, this is my own view now. I said this when I was in grad school. because some of that discussion was taking place then. And I said then that here's how I would decide the issue. If you can agree that 10 is Ferris Paper 10 is written by James Madison, and you don't dispute that, then I can tell you this. Then James Madison wrote 51 because you can detect the more you could see that the writing style comes out more there to be able to see that 9 Hamilton, 10 James Madison, and you say, well, it's very since it's close between the two of them because 9 was picked up. 9 was written by Hamilton, who opened up this view of democracy and the dangers of that. And 10, Madison picked up where Hamilton stopped and picked it up and carried it further down that road. So they don't disagree with 10 being written by James Madison. If they don't disagree with 10 being written by James Madison, then it should not be so much of an argument about writing number 51. That's my view of it. And I tried to throw that into the discussion that day because I read every last one of the Federalist Papers. I need to go back and refresh my memory about some of it. But the other thing is that we need to also read the anti-Federalist Papers. There's a good book out by a writer named Ketchum. Let's see, Ketchum is spelled Ketchum. I think he spells his name. It's been a long time, but I think he spells his name that way. And he has a very good book out about the anti-Federalist Papers. We need to read those papers also. They have a lot of information in there. Now, here's what I want to talk about today, because this is becoming a very current conversation that we're having, and I don't want this conversation to get out of control. We have a 2-term limit on the number of terms the president can serve can serve in the presidency, and that was placed in the Constitution in 1950 and 51. The 22nd Amendment was added to the Constitution at that time, and I consider that to be the anti-Franklin Delano Roosevelt Amendment. There was no need for it before Roosevelt, although some had tried to penetrate that precedent set by George Washington. George Washington was so powerful as a figure to follow that no one dared, at the very beginning, at the point in which is more close to when Washington was alive, Washington having, let's see, Washington was born in 1732 and died in 1799, I think it was. I think that the persona of Washington was such, and it was so close to the time period, there was just no way in the world at that point they're going to defy the father of the country and seek more terms of service in the office that Washington served. And just the fact he is sat in that seat as the president of the United States was enough to, in fact, calm it down close to the time in which Washington would have been on the scene. Now, there's some movement toward penetrating that precedent before Franklin Delano Roosevelt. There was some movement in that direction by Ulysses S. Grant, for example. Grant had been elected in 1868 and was elected again in 72, and then considered, because he had been drinking that day because he had a little bit of an alcoholic problem. But he had. There was some talk about him having penetrated that glass ceiling. That's a glass ceiling there. From the time of Washington up to 1940, that glass ceiling had not been penetrated. We keep talking about glass ceiling. That's a glass ceiling there, set without a law, set by precedent, set by the greatest president this country has produced. Take my word for that one.
I got a breakdown too when you get to it about how many people have been, there's congressmen and senators, length of service and stuff like that. I got a list through Chat GPT if you want to read it into the conversation or.
Yeah.
Okay, here, well, I'll start to introduce it here, okay?
Okay.
And I got a crowning one I think we should focus on too.
Okay. Sure.
Okay, Chuck Grassley, he's a Republican from Iowa. He's been in power 44 years since January 3rd, 1981. Then Senator Ron Wyden, he's a Democrat from Oregon. He's been in service for 24 years.
Mhm.
Chuck Schumer, a Democrat, has been in 24 years in Senate, following 18 years in the House. Okay, add that together. Senator Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky, Republican, 40 years since January 3rd,
Too long.
1985. Okay, Representative Hal Rogers, a Republican from Kentucky, 05, Republican, been there 44 years since January 3rd, 1981. Representative Chris Smith, Republican from New Jersey, party affiliation, 44 years since January 3rd, 1981. Representative Steny Hoyer, Democrat from Maryland, Democrat, 44 years. Okay, Representative Frank Pallone, Democrat from New Jersey, Democrat, like I said, 36 years. Representative Richard Neal, the Democrat from Massachusetts, been in there for 36 years.
Mhm.
Representative Eleanor Holmes Norton, D.C. at large, party fellow Democrat, 34 years. But here's I'd like to want to focus on. I said I pulled it up from ChatGPT. They did all the research. The Dingell family here in Michigan.
Mhm.
Okay, John Dingell was in power John Dingell from 1933 to 1955. So he's part of the FDR administration. He was the U.S. representative for Michigan's 15th district for 22 years. Then his son, John Jr., got in 1955 to 2015. He was in office 59 years before he died.
Yeah.
Then Debbie Dingell, John Jr.'s wife, took over. And when he died in 2015 to present, she's in power. She's been in it for 10 years. Total Dingell family congressional service, 1933 to 2025, 22 years for senior, 59 years for junior, 10 years for Debbie, equals 91 years. 91 years.
You hit your forehead. What are people thinking? John, that's incredible. When you look at that list, where did they put the former Speaker of the House, the guy from Kentucky? What's it?
Mitch McConnell?
Yeah, Mitch McConnell.
Yeah, we got that. Hold on here. Mitch McConnell, 40 years.
40 years?
40 years. Mitch McConnell, 40 years.
Look, Mitch and all the rest of them. Now, Mitch is going out after this. He knows he's not popular enough now. He's been exposed by coming out against after he had begged Donald Trump for his endorsement in his last campaign, and he was in trouble at that point. They're thinking about throwing him out then, but then Donald Trump came and was convinced that he would get back on board, and he took the support of Donald Trump and then turned against him once he got back in there. And now that became he's part of the unforgiven. But he's in there. How many years, John? You say he was in there for
40 years.
40 years.
That's right. Okay, but the Dingell family, 90 years. I mean, I get a lot, but that's why bother hold elections? They basically just become have a little palace now in Detroit, and the Dingell family's now like the royalty there. You know, they all got crowns and they got like portraiture, like Buckingham Palace or something like that. You know,
yeah, John. What they did was they refuted the king, the kingship. They defeated King George III, and then these guys come later on in the aftermath of Washington setting the precedent, and they've come in other areas of the government, and they have now these elected persons who are, in a sense, kings, in the sense that the king does not step down from power.
I like to ask the people because I mean, I'm in Michigan, and I can see if you like a family, or you like somebody, keep them in around as long as I can understand. I mean, but I like to ask the people who are in Dingell's district because at one different time, John Jr. faced different. They redistricted, so he was in the 15th at one time. Then he got switched around, because of the redistricting. But I'd like to ask the people, the constituents of that area, are you really being served with these families being in there for so long? What have they done that's uniquely beneficial for you
Mhm.
as if all this length of time? Are they worthwhile? Are they worth their keep?
John, that's a question that all these persons that are returning these politicians over and over again to the elective office. What is the intellectual wherewithal, the prowess they bring to the job that qualifies in your mind them to be returned over and over again in the elective office? At one time, the way it was set up at the very beginning, and of course, they not only used the writings of the founders like Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison, but they were using the example. First of all, the example of George Washington. Washington, you don't tell Washington to lead. Washington went there for specific reasons. And once that had been accomplished, the great George Washington, he was without a doubt the greatest president this country has produced. There's no. We need to stop having that debate and just get on with it because that's not even debatable. Nobody could have done what nobody you say could have done. No one would have done what George Washington did. They were trying to throw a coronation in front of this person, flowers and all that, and the red carpet. And what George Washington was doing was turning it down because he knew how dangerous it was in order to stand up in the place of King George III and then start that as another tradition for the country. How that would have been problematical. And to his great credit, no one will ever be able to do that again. It only can happen one time, and it happened at the beginning of the country's history, and it set a tumbling effect along that line. And that wasn't broken to 1940 with the third term that Franklin Delano Roosevelt saw. Roosevelt should have. I know the war was going on, but we had a civil war in this country. They call it a civil war. I don't call it that, but they call it a civil war. And they um, held an election during that time period. And there's no, and not that they did not have the election in 1940, but they acted like they had to break the precedent because the war was going on, and they should have continued the tradition of the country, which should stand regardless as to the situation that we're in. Their tradition to be maintained, and stop throwing the baby out with the bathwater by doing different things because the times have changed. The tradition must be maintained and have some idea of continuity with the present, the future, and the past, and let that begin to be a continuing and a refining of it so you can actually make it better and do better. But you don't change the tradition because the circumstance changed. And we should have learned that. Matter of fact, we fought all these wars, and in these wars, the tradition of the presidential election being held every 4 years. And it's still that today, it's still unbroken. We never broken the tradition of the president being elected every 4 years. That continues. That's a good thing. But there's some other traditions we had that fell by the wayside. Now at the convention, let us say this. At that convention in 1787 in Philadelphia, with people arriving at different times and adding when he got there, added their part into the conversation. I don't know of anyone that was there that remained quiet the whole time. Washington was there as the president of the convention, but he was more in a role as the chief officer over the convention meetings, and he didn't have a lot to say. He was not there to say anything. He was not there as a delegate, but because he was there, and many of them wanted him there because it would give some credibility to the meeting, because people had a lot of questions about just the same questions they have right now. People are hesitant even today. They call it a Constitutional Convention because it could spiral into something that was not intended. As this convention, in fact, itself did in 1787. They went there under uh, the umbrella of being sent there to do some revision, and some went there. I know they went there with different schemes in mind. There was a lot of uh, I don't want to say conspiracy. It was not conspiracy. It was people that had something in the back of their mind that we're not going to go to Philadelphia and revise that. The 13 Articles of Confederation. We're not going there to revise that. We're going there for something different. So this cannot be revised to the extent we think it needs to be revised upon which you can build the American government. And so some of them had in the back of their mind. I know Madison had in the back of his mind. There's a very good book about Madison, written by one of the Cheneys, not Liz Cheney, but one of his family members wrote a book on Madison, very good book, and it's very clear that Madison went there in the back of his mind that it's impossible. That this document is so flawed. To go there with the idea of revising that, it would take the whole convention time just to. It was so flawed. You spend all your time doing revision. We have another document to put in this place. So what they really did, let's be honest about this. What they really did was push the document to the side to get on with it. That's what happened in Philadelphia. They're not gonna. They pushed that document to the side. And then the different persons there that brought other ideas about the government and how to set it up, that kicked in and so on and so forth. But they had the great George Washington there, and Washington had earned his spurs by being magnanimous enough to stand down in 1783 and rode back to Mount Vernon after 7 years being out in the battlefield, beyond which, if he had not made the sacrifices that he made, that war could not have been won, not with the suffering they went through. And anybody that stands up here today and does not stand up there resolutely to represent that is almost like blasphemy. It's secular. It's secularly blasphemous to do that, because you have to pay honor to the fact that suffered. We couldn't do that today. That could not be done today. Not with the sacrifice that were required to bring that result about. And George Washington actually, it's a lot of things you can say about that, but Washington would not stop fighting. And really, if he stopped fighting, that he was going. He's going to be this guy. Washington was going to end up at the end of a rope. So part of it is driven with the idea of what they had in fact bought into. Let's be honest here. They had made a pledge. They knew the consequences of that pledge they made. They knew that when they signed that document, the Declaration of Independence, and put their 56 names on that document. They knew then what they were doing. They weren't trying to back into it. They were putting their name down on paper. And you have to honor that. I guess I'm just beating a dead horse here, because I say this all the time. And wherever I go, I have the utmost respect for the framers, and too much respect really to run for an office and do what these politicians are doing. What they should do is respect the fact that the framers of the Constitution, all of them, at some point stepped down. Most of the ones that were there didn't even run for elective office. Madison, who came in as the fourth president of the United States and was there 18 after Jefferson left from 1808 to 1816. Well, 1817, if you look at the fact they elected in the even year and out of they leave office in the odd year. They've been leaving in March at that point. But look how they stood down voluntarily. They didn't go there in, enrich themselves. They went there to do service to the country. And the honor and to running for an office is an honor, and it should be treated as an honor if you're running for the office for the same reason they ran for it, and there's so few of them doing that. I don't really want to say this, but the truth of the matter is that none of them are running for the reason that the framers ran for office at that time. They're not trying to build this nation. Most of them are parasites. These people are parasites in Washington, and I'm going to be writing about this a lot more in the future about, and I've been writing a lot of provocative articles in that as it is. But I'm writing some very provocative articles, and I'm calling what they are. We have a parasitic Congress. We have a parasitic Supreme Court. Vultures in both of those places.
Actually, if you look at all public service, for with the elected officialdom and stuff like that, if they're no longer, and they haven't been serving our purpose for years, they are all parasitic. I mean, basically, their existence extracted with. But and the thing is, this is basically like a tick on your back that's got a guy holding a gun to your head.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's what these people are.
That's what they are, John.
That's what these people are. There's nothing noble about being a politician. Now, if you go in there just to get a situation, you go in there holding your nose, know you're going to get crappy smelling, and you're going into the outhouse for a while so you can clean the damn outhouse out. But these people become part of the problem.
John, that is so true, and it's so tragic, given how great the country's beginning point was. And people ask, when was the country great? It was great at that point. They had to be great. To have been less than that, they could not have achieved that objective that they achieved. It's amazing what they were able to achieve. Going up against the bulging, at this point, developing British Empire. It's not at that point what it would be later on in the 19th century and beyond. But it was becoming that at that point after the 1588. The British defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588. After that, Britain was now the mistress of the seas, and it was able to do a lot with that in terms of the commercial aspect to it, because you have to ship. There are no planes at this point, so the shipping was by, if you're going to be shipping out off the continent, that shipping had to be by sea. And by Britain owning that after 1588, it was able to, in fact, get its the markets around the world, and it was a budging empire. And they stood against that empire, developing as it was at that time, but it was still the most powerful empire at that point in time in history. And to go up against it and do what they did, and then the sacrifices it took for them to accomplish that, you have to really admire that. I have a lot. I'm talking about people walking in the snow. You could tell where Washington soldiers were, because there'll be blood in the snow. People were wearing tying socks. When you're wearing cloth and the cloth gets wet and your foot is bleeding because you're not wearing shoes, you're in the snow like that, and your foot is bleeding. It's unbelievable when you think about what they went through, and then accomplish the things they accomplished. The goal, the eyes, keep your eyes on the prize. They kept their eyes on what they were trying to accomplish. And I don't think there's a person in Washington right now, maybe Trump would be the closest to it in terms of having a goal in mind and trying to accomplish something. I don't think most of them up there are trying to accomplish anything. I think most of them up there just bleeding bleeding the country. And many of them, I know you're not going to like me saying this, but many of them should be up there tried for treason. This is treason what they're creating against this country today in Washington. None dare call it treason. John Horner's book, yeah, they should call it what it is. This is treason. Cleaning up this mess that Biden made. They had a report last night. I'll tell you this. They had a report on news. My station is Newsmax, and I do watch Fox as a side. That's my second station I get my information from. But I watch Newsmax more than I watch anything else. And they had a program on that news on Newsmax last night. I love this program that's put out by Rob Finnerty. He does a very good job. He's a very smart man. You can see the intellect there. I think he's taken over from Greg Kelly. Greg Kelly was once the greatest voice on Newsmax. He's not there anymore. I think Finnerty is taking over a large part of that viewership. Kelly had it at first, the most watched program on Newsmax. Finnerty is that now. And last night, Finnerty was making some strong points about this whole thing of what is happening with these purveyors of these are purveyors of these are the people, the purveyors of lies. These politicians, and he took them to task, and I couldn't argue with any of the points he made, because that's all they're doing to the American people's land, because they don't intend to do representation. We're being taxed right now. And we started out fighting because of what they said was taxation without representation, and that was true. But what we're doing now is that we're not fighting over taxation without representation. But we don't have representation. We're just not fighting over it. They're not representing us. And Fanny was pointed out last night in this program, and he's right about what he was saying. I couldn't disagree with anything he was talking about, because all of it was true. We have no representation in Washington today. And what we really have, I wrote about this in a Facebook post. What we really have is that we have a communist government in Washington, as quiet as it's kept. Donald Trump is fighting in Washington right now against communism. The people that run this government, these are communists running this government. And communism sneaked into this country on the back of the founding of the CIA in 1947. And they were responding to the aftermath of World War II, and then the development of the Cold War. Just like you have them sneaking into Donald Trump's campaign when he was getting started in 2017, he had won the election, and how they talked about might as well send somebody down there and get in this campaign and see what you can find out. They did that to Harry S. Truman. You can read Evan Stanton's book about Joseph Kennedy. I mean Joseph McCarthy. Joseph McCarthy. Stanton has a book out called Blacked Out in History, and that's McCarthy. When I was teaching American history, I was noticing that these books did not cover the McCarthy period. And I don't think you have a high school student coming out of school today. I don't even think it was true in the past, but certainly not true today, because they don't do as much studying as they once did in the past. I don't think you have a student right now in high school anywhere in the country that have heard the name Joseph McCarthy or know about the McCarthy era because he'd been blacked out in history, as is being said. Ann Coulter had an article I was thinking about it about McCarthy. I think it goes back. I think she had an article out around 2007, and I remember that because I was doing some research, and I came across an article. And I used some of her research in some of the papers I was writing, and that is a part of history that we should read because, see, I'm contending right now that they're lying on George Washington, saying that he was the first president to use executive privilege. George Washington did not use executive privilege. George Washington used the separation of powers. The first president used the executive privilege was Eisenhower. And Eisenhower used it because they were getting ready to call some of his scions in to testify before the Congress because they were investigating the communists in government, and there were communists in government. And McCarthy was ferreting that out. Some of his tactics were not as good as they should have been. But McCarthy's plans were no joke. And we need to go back and pick up that part of the history and put it back in the history books so that students can come now and look at that, and then we can have people do research on whether he was right or whether they were right. A good place to start is M. Stanton's book. Yeah, that book would be very important to start out with. Blacked out in history, because he's been blacked out in history, but that part of history is very important. And I'm saying this after having said on the air that I don't think you can actually put together what happened in Dallas until you understand that part of the history, because some of that has to do with that part of history. People don't believe that. How are you gonna make a connection from '63 back to '47 when it says, but to '47 under Truman? Well, '47 is when the CIA was set up under Truman. That's how I make the connection. And I have to tell you now, those persons that are saying that this happened and it has no other root, this person did this by himself and nobody else was involved in it. So you can run those kinds of themes by others, but you can't say that. Not to anyone that has done the kind of studying that requires you to know that cannot be true. Things began to go haywire very much out of control in the 40s. And you know, history has a tumbling effect. People say that history repeats itself. No, history doesn't. They say history goes around in a circle. It doesn't go around in a circle. It goes in a spiral. And you see if you go back and look at it, you can see that it is tumbling into something else. In hindsight, you can look and see, okay, this interface into this and morphed into that, and this morphed into this, and all of it none of it might have been intended to be the outcome that it was, but this tumbling of history is that's the end result of it. And some of what happened in '47 is what you saw happening in Dallas. That's what I'm saying. And all these scholars that are, and there's some scholars out here now. The one that I listen to a lot, more than the others, because I think he's honest, is Jefferson Moore. I listen to him. I listen to him because I like to listen to those who I think are honest. To call it like it is, and have only the truth as the only friend they have in what they write. Those kind of writers attract me because there are not too many of them out there. And there are some out there who are very partisan and not going. I don't care what kind. You can flash the facts right in front of their face, and they're gonna refuse to and tell them to read it. These are the facts. Read this, and they know it to be the facts and will not read it. Yeah, people like that on television. They won't. They won't. They know what the truth is. They won't say it. And people that picked it up on that's what they picked up on these stations, and that's why they don't watch them anymore. We get now news now from Joe Rogan and Tucker Carlson. Bongini before he took the latest job as assistant in the Justice Department he took under Trump. I'm glad to see him there and all of that, but he had a good program. And these people are doing some enlightening things. They're not, I guess, because the advertising is different, and they're not subjected to having to toe the line. Because if you get an advertising from they don't want you embarrassing their product, and you got to be very conscious of where those lines are. They don't tell you what to say, but you kind of know by the leaning of the station, and they know. And then when the weather changed like it did in the election that we just had in 2024, you saw what happened there. The script was flipped, and Donald Trump came through and shining colors. He had a mandate, and that's why Joy Reid is gone. You think they would have fired her if Trump had lost and all that? No, she would have still been there, but she became unpalatable. You think that that guy named James, they wanted to give the president all the trouble. Every time he stood up and wouldn't give the microphone up. So disrespectful to the president of the United States. And I know what he felt about the framers, by how he treated the president of the United States. Because this is not about Donald Trump. This is about the institutional office that was said about George Washington. That's how I see it. And those persons that see it as this individual stuff, get out of here. This is an institution. And the father of the institution is back there when George Washington was elected president, the first president under the Constitution of the United States. That's saying something. And for you to be in that seat right now and disrespect that seat, that is saying you almost disqualify yourself in that seat. And very few of them have qualified themselves in that seat. Most of them have not respected that seat because they don't understand the tradition that was set up and what it took to bring that tradition about. It took a great president to do what George Washington did. The man stood down from power. And today we're talking about Washington set the precedent up for the president. And we're saying that should be extended. You should not go back on that. What you should do is seek to expand it so that applies to everybody who has an elective office in the nation's capital. It was never intended for them to be there forever. John just read those names off and the number of years that they've been up there sitting in a chair. They're not up there doing any work on behalf of the American people. If they were doing that, how did this country get so much out of control if they're doing that work? If they were doing their job, how do you explain that they have a $36 trillion debt? And that debt is there because of what Donald Trump is now undoing. And what they did was simply became the cash cow for everybody. Why? They wanted the influence. So they were doing these bad trade agreements. Everybody loved that aspect to being connected to the United States. But they were selling the country out in the proposition they were creating around that. And that was, in fact, giving everybody a piece of the country. That's what the trade deficits were about. They were buying influence in those societies. That's why they have all these militaries around the world, where the U.S. military is everywhere. They're willing to sell the country out to bring that result about. There's one person I have to say that has understanding and appreciation of that, and this man is not considered a friend of the country. He's one of the best friends this country has. Jeffrey Sachs is a great friend of this country because this man tells the country the truth.
You know, it's like basically, I don't think I would actually sit down and actually have a disagreement with that man. I really don't, from what I've seen. Because, and the thing is, his name is Sachs. Is like, I thought, being what that name is, I thought he would be like a real pro. No, he actually is more concerned about the United States and our course of action. And, and that type of person, years ago, I probably would have said a lefty, I would have dismissed him. But as I gotten older, a lot of the opposition I heard from the left, like about the First Amendment during the first, like the protests. Like, no, you can't protest Israel. You're automatically a Hamas supporter if you say anything about Israel. And that what they call the binary, I guess you could say, is ridiculous. Okay, but Jeffrey Sachs is, I mean, I can't find anything that I've seen. I heard him say that I disagree with.
He's an honest broker. I have to give him a lot of credit for that because he's on a lot of fire at Columbia University. They're the ones over there right now tearing the campus up in protest of Tesla.
So the thing is, everybody's got a right to protest, but it doesn't mean you got a right to occupy buildings, take over buildings. You don't have a right to tear that stuff down or impede people's daily traffic. The daily lives. You don't have a right to do that. You mean I believe in protest. The First Amendment gives you a right to peacefully protest. Okay, and you can chant, you can sing, you can maybe use blowhorns. I believe in all that, but what they're doing there, taking over buildings, those are not their buildings. Okay, they're not. It's the people's buildings.
You don't have the right to tear up anyone's property. And doing that's not free speech. That's they finally have named it what it is. That's domestic terrorism. And I'm glad to see Pam Bundy in that seat because I think she's serious about what she's doing. And she said to those persons that are doing the things they're doing in terms of tearing up the property of Tesla and those industries and those different places where Tesla is being sold.
Okay,
we're not gonna negotiate. And we're gonna prosecute them to the extent of the law.
So I'll just go back to, I know that you like the historical referencing. I remember reading, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but during the time of the American Revolution, when they had loyalists, the people were loyalists to England yet. They're in areas where they're getting outnumbered by the people who want to break away from England. They had property, the loyalists did. I heard of there's few incidents where there was those places were burned or vandalized. But most of the time they stood against that. And basically, a lot of the loyalist families took off for several years. They came back and they found their buildings and their houses intact when they came back.
Yeah,
John, that's what I heard.
Yeah, once that fighting was over, it's amazing. Read Ann Coulter's book. That's a very good. She does a good job in the book called, I think it's called Mugged. And she has 2 chapters in there, one about the American Revolution and one about the French Revolution. She's comparing the two. And you look at the American Revolution. Once the Revolutionary War was over in 1783, this idea of retaliating because a person with disagreement, that wasn't what the framers were doing and the colonists were doing after that war was over. The fighting was over. Now it's about mending the fences because you have to now put the country together. And that's where the emphasis was.
See, that's a criticism I can offer later. I'm just interjecting too much here, but
no, go ahead.
But the Palestinian leadership, okay, they did the revolutionary thing, blowing up things and killing people, make statements is easy to do. Anybody can do that. But now you got these people on board allow you to have your own country. You got to have you got to have a people who can be farsighted enough to actually develop a country, the mundane day-to-day operation stuff, an economy, food, water, sanitation, that kind of prosaic, very boring stuff. It's really fun to be a revolutionary. Right. You can wear a beret, you can smoke a cigar, you can talk about, with this total disdain of, the system, but you have to establish a system if you want to keep it continued. This country, which you're allegedly fighting for, you got to have the intelligence enough to know how to do that.
Yeah, and you have to have the intelligence to also know when to stop the fighting. The fighting is over, and you have to now go on to the next step. What is the what's the next step to be taken? That question sometimes stop you from wanting to fight. And you're not wanting to fight to stop because you don't know what the next step is.
It's like there's a parallel between some of the civil rights hucksters.
Yeah, that's exactly what they did. They didn't know what to do after that is over, and they're still doing the civil rights work that's already been done. They're just repeating the same thing. They don't know what the next step is. That's why they keep complaining about the same thing over and over again. Much of that complaining belongs in the past. What Crocker is talking about, none of that stuff has any resonance with us today and what is happening in this country today. They're trying to talk about things that happened back in the time of the days of the Klan. You can't even find a Klan member today. No Klan member, nobody's going to be putting on a sheet and we don't discover who's underneath that sheet. We want to know who's on that sheet today. And I can tell you this, ain't no official going to be under there as it was in that time period when you had Bull Connor and rest of them out there doing things they were doing. Then that day is that you're not going to see that again. But you have to know what the next step is if you step out there, because once you accomplish that goal and you set out to make sure that there's enfranchisement of voters and they're not being denied the right to vote based on their race, color, creed, nationality, and so on and so forth, their ethnicity. Once that is won and that, then the question is, once the barriers have been removed, then what are the actions of the group then asking to walk in to go into those doors? Because a lot of now the emphasis must be placed upon those that are making the argument to go through the doors. That I see that when I'm going to Africa, and in fact when this is aired, I will be in Africa, and that's one of the things that's a question that Africa has never answered. That what next question? They haven't answered that question over there. What's next? They have that question is still being asked all over the continent of Africa. What's to be done now? When Nkrumah was out there and Jomo Kenyatta, Lumumba, and the rest of them were out there and they're out there fighting, it was a question to be raised about, you have to fight this battle. But in Ahmad's work called 2000 Season, the question is, what will happen after you won all the things you've been fighting for? The fighting is what happens in the aftermath of the fighting is harder to resolve than the fighting. The fighting just simply mow down more of the other side and then mow down on your side, and who's going to be the last army standing? That's resolved on the battlefield. But it's the aftermath of what happens on the battlefield that really is going to be consequential in terms of seeing whether or not the fighting was worth it based upon the results of it. It was worth it in this case right here because the country set up something that was very unique by a person making great decisions in the aftermath of the war. Washington made two great decisions: stepping down in 1783, stepping down again in 1799, and going back to Mount Vernon. People you cannot imagine how shocked persons were because they never seen anything like that before. The president is a person that they want to make king, and there's Washington pouring water and poo-pooing that on their parade when they were scared of what would happen if Washington stood down. They knew he was a known quantity. He had stepped down in '83, refused the coronation, and they knew they could trust George Washington. And George Washington rode off a second time after serving 2 terms, putting things in place. And then having done that, what other work was there for George Washington to really do? And Washington rode off and so on. And the assumption was that others would be just as much standing up in his shoes and be just as much foreboding in taking too much power away from the people as Washington was foreboding in that regard. And they just thought this would be created in perpetuity. I was saying at the beginning of the program that we talk a lot about the Federalists, but there was also a group there that Ketchum was talking about, the Anti-Federalists, and they were the ones over there that were kind of like not in that Hamilton school of thought. Hamilton was definitely a Federalist, and he would be what you would call a big government figure today.
That's why they had the musical on Broadway.
That's right. That's why they would do a musical. I tell you what you do. Write me when they put a musical on Broadway of James Madison. Let me see you do that musical. put that to music. The father of the Constitution. Put that one to music. Let's see what happens. No, Hamilton, because Hamilton was a statist,
You know,
and that's what they're celebrating.
I hope I got to interject here. Please forgive me on this, but
Oh.
all the way through it, we're talking about people getting power and not be able to basically to screw the pooch, drop it, lose the ball, right? And here's a song. There's a group called Rush. You ever heard of it? From a band from Canada, and very popular back in the '80s when I was growing. I was in high school, and there's a song from the New World Man, and here's a line from that. He's noble enough to know what's right, but weak enough not to choose it. He's wise enough to win the world, but fool enough to lose it. And that's basically that's a good. It sums up what people with power, what they face, the dilemma they face.
Special people. If you don't have the right people in place to do the rest of the job, all the things you fought for could be lost just like that in the bat of an eye. In a split second, you can lose it all because you can forget. Once you get in power, I think you can read. You could actually see that in what George Orwell was writing in his second greatest book. Everybody talks about 1984. It was a great book, great novel, made some great points. But his book called Animal Farm, which is the second of his most noted works, is very important to understand the major point Orwell was making, and that was the forgetfulness when you get into power. That is, say you were out there suffering and complaining and all the rest of it and fighting for the changes to bring something different about. And then the result is in fact achieved. And then you get into power yourself and you forget that which you were suffering and how that felt, which should stay your hand in terms of causing it in the lives of others and in your own life, as a matter of fact. And those animals, the way he's saying in Animal Farm is that those animals out there were suffering under the farmers, the proletariat. The animal proletariat would be the group rising against the merchant group, and get into power. And then what happens when you get in power? You forget. Your memory is more vague because you don't want to be reminded of how it was out there. You don't want anybody telling you about you. Well, you just feel this way about it, but you changed your mind now. Yeah, they changed their mind about a lot of things because you think differently about it out there than when you're in here. The question, the challenge is to feel about it in there that you felt about it when you're outside. If you can maintain that, if you can maintain the revolutionary presence when the revolution is over, and they did that here and did not do it in France. France kept on chopping off heads. And Robespierre, who was one of the authors of the French Revolution, that circular thing that happened, he'll eventually get caught up in it. And you have them asking in the aftermath of the French Revolution, what did you do during the French Revolution? And they'll tell you, I lived. That is, say they survived it. Our revolution is a little bit different because these persons they knew they had to fight. And they knew what they were fighting for. And once that had been achieved, the fighting, what's the fighting for now? Let's do the rest of the work. And that's where George Washington comes in. Set up a precedent where you relinquish power. You don't embrace it, you relinquish it. And we need to, in fact, embrace that in this time period, and we need to expand it. Not to go back on it, maintain the 22nd Amendment, the two-term limit for the president, but understand that is not enough. We have to expand it to include all the other office holders in the nation's capital, and expand it to the members of Congress. We shouldn't have a Supreme Court that sits for life on the court. That should be something we look at as well. And we should not have anybody who doesn't have to worry about being turned out of power, because if they don't have a fear of being turned out from power, you can believe power will be abused. Term limits for everybody, folks. That's one of the solutions we can go to. That's the next step for us right now. Okay, we got to get back next week at it again, and we'll be back next week. We'll be doing 5 programs along the lines of a discussion today, and we'll be talking about different things have to do with the Constitution and how to hopefully get back on the right foot. Until next week, once you follow your dream, you don't follow your dream, you never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.